Hi, my name's Mois Navon. I'm a doctoral student here at Bar Ilan's Department of Jewish Philosophy. I'm also one of the founding engineers of Mobileye. I designed this chip. This is the chip that's powering the autonomous vehicle revolution. The autonomous vehicle revolution is going to change the world we live in. But first and foremost, it's going to save lives. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the World Health Organization puts the number at 3,400. 3,400 people die on the roads every day. With the advent of autonomous vehicles, that number is going to approach zero. Nevertheless, there are going to be accidents, unexpected things. A child runs chasing its ball into the streets and there's not enough time for the autonomous vehicle to put on its brakes. It's left with a choice of running over the kid or driving off the cliff. There are many ethical dilemmas that we can conjure up that the autonomous vehicle will have to think about as it's being programmed. And that's where Jewish philosophy comes into play, or more specifically, Jewish ethics. Jewish ethics gives us the sources to grapple with these ethical dilemmas. And that's what I would like to talk about today. Probably the most famous ethical dilemma is known as the trolley problem. The trolley problem is an ethical thought experiment that was put forth by a philosophy professor by the name of Philippa Foot in 1967. I imagine that most of you are familiar with the trolley problem, but just to make things really clear, I thought we should look at this video clip. So this is a clip from a relatively popular American TV series called The Better Place. That's a euphemism for the worst place. It's actually hell. The white guy here that you see is actually the devil himself. The black guy that you see here is a philosophy professor. And how do you give a philosophy professor hell? Well, you ask him to resolve the trolley problem. Let's watch.
Why don't you just tell me the right answer? Well, that's what's so great about the trolley problem, is that there is no right answer. This is why everyone hates moral philosophy professors.
I'm on your side here, dude, but he is not wrong.
Okay, Michael, trust me. When it comes to human ethics, I just know more than you. I've been studying it my whole life. It's just that it's so theoretical, you know? I mean, maybe there's a more concrete approach. Here, let's try this. Oh, God! Michael, what did you do? I made the trolley problem real so we could see how the ethics would actually play out. There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Here are the levers to switch the tracks. Their choice. The thing is, we speak up. Well, it's tricky. I mean, on one hand, you was right for purely utilitarian worldview. Okay, so what did we learn?
Okay, so now that everybody understands exactly what the trolley problem is, let's try to deal with it. The fact of the matter is that there are many ethical approaches that have been used throughout the ages to deal with ethical dilemmas like this. The 2 most prominent ones are known as deontology or utilitarianism, which is a subset of consequentialism. Utilitarians basically look at the consequences or the utility. What comes out of this case? How do we decide for the best consequences? So the champion of this idea is a guy by the name of Jeremy Bentham, British philosopher, and he phrased it as follows: "It is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." So there you have it. A utilitarian would look at the trolley problem and say, we need to make as many people happy. 5 people is better than 1 person. And so we turn the trolley and we drive over the individual on the side. Now, deontologists look at things quite differently. Deontology, by the way, is just a fancy word that means we follow the rules. Deon in Greek means duty, and so deontologists follow their duties. I would say that probably Moses is the first Jewish deontologist. He was on Sinai and brought down the 10 duties, or as they're more popularly known, the 10 commandments. The one that's pertinent for us today is thou shalt not murder. So if a deontologist looks at this trolley problem, he says, okay, I understand it's good to save a lot of people, but on the other hand, if I turn the wheel and actively choose to kill this one individual, that's murder, and I'm not allowed to murder anybody. Now, you may be saying to yourself, yeah, but I mean, intuitively, it seems like we should save as many people. As a matter of fact, they've done studies, and when you ask people on the street, they would say, save as many people as possible. But, you know, when you put names or titles on these people, the question becomes a little bit more difficult. What if that one individual that you want to drive over is a very important person in the country? What if that person is the President of the United States? No politics, please. So you understand, playing God is not a simple game, and so we really need to try to grapple with this issue. Before we get into the trolley problem and how Judaism deals with that, I would like to try to simplify the problem and take away the numbers. And instead of 5 against 1, how about 1 against 1? So a modern philosopher by the name of Jason Mylar, he put forth the following problem called the tunnel problem. So the tunnel problem is, imagine you're driving down a one-line highway, a single-lane highway, and you're in a tunnel. And before you is a pedestrian, and you've lost your brakes. Now you have a choice before you. You either drive over the pedestrian, or you turn the steering wheel and you drive into the wall, apparently killing yourself. So it's 1 against 1. How do you make that decision? Well, Judaism actually has addressed this many, many years ago in a Mishnah. It was discussing the case of a birthing mother who is having difficulty, and basically either she's going to die or the baby's going to die. And how do we deal with such a situation? So the Mishnah answers, Ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh. One life is not set aside for another life. Basically, we can't play God. We don't know the value of an individual, whether it's adults, whether it's kids, whether it's a newborn baby and the mother. We can't play that game. We take the egalitarian stance and say everybody's equal, and so we don't intervene with nature. Now, that's all very nice and good when we're talking about 2 individuals on the side, but what about when it's your life? You have to sacrifice for somebody else. So the Gemara in Pesachim actually addresses this question, and it says as follows: the governor of a city said, go and kill Plony. Plony is just a name like John Smith, somebody that we don't know. Go and kill Plony, or you will be killed. What do you do? So Rabbah, who's one of the big thinkers in the Talmud, he responds and says, you must give your own life rather than commit murder. For in what way do you see that your blood is redder than his? Perhaps his blood is redder. Basically, what is being put forth here, again, is the egalitarian stance. We as human beings have no way to assess the value of one individual versus another, and not even our own value versus other people. And so we are forbidden to commit murder, even to save our own very lives. Now, everybody accepts this, but there's an instance which is brought into question by the Tosfot. The Tosfot are a group of commentators who discuss all the dilemmas and add to them on the Gemara. And the Tosfot said, you know, we understand you can't murder somebody, no problem. But what about if you were just involved passively? You didn't actively go take a gun. The governor didn't say, go kill Plony. Rather, the governor said, allow me to throw you onto a baby such that you will end up crushing him to death. So now, you didn't actually do anything. You were just kind of a bystander to this act. So the Tosfot say, one would not be demanded to sacrifice one's own life, for he did no action. In Aramaic, de lo avid ma'aseh. So basically what the Tosfot are saying here is that, you know, if we have no way to judge people, so, you know, I understand I can't kill somebody, but maybe I am worth more, and so why should I actually kill myself or be killed rather than be involved passively in a murder? Reb Chaim of Brisk, who's one of the big Jewish legal thinkers of the previous generations, so he says, you know, the Rambam uses the same logic to come to a different conclusion. The Rambam says, if we're all equal and you can't judge between blood and blood, so by what right do you have to push aside someone else's life, even passively? So we have here what's called a machloket, or a discrepancy of opinions, where the Tosfot say you can be involved passively in a murder to save yourself, and the Rambam says we don't care, actively, passively, you may not be involved in any kind of killing to save yourself. There's another Gemara that's very famous, talks about 2 people in the desert. They basically come to the same conclusion, so in the interest of time, we'll skip it. And then that brings us to the issue of suicide. So we said you can't go and take a gun and shoot somebody or allow somebody to throw you onto somebody, but do you have to commit suicide in order to avoid killing somebody? So there are actually three opinions on this. Some say it's forbidden under all circumstances for you to kill yourself. Some people say it's permitted if you want to be an altruist. And some people say you are obligated. The Ramban says that you are obligated to commit suicide and not kill anybody. You must take your own life and not take somebody else's life. Nevertheless, Rav Dikovsky, who's a modern legal commentator, he explains that that only applies to actively killing somebody. So if you were involved in a passive murder, like we said, somebody would throw you onto a baby, so you wouldn't be obligated to kill yourself. Suicide would only be obligated by the Ramban in order to avoid actually actively murdering somebody else. So now with all those parameters in place, we can now approach the tunnel problem. So the tunnel problem comes in two flavors, passive and active. You're in a tunnel, and let's say it's a straight tunnel, not like in this picture. You're on a straight tunnel, there's a pedestrian in front of you, you don't have your brakes. What are you going to do? Well, from all of the sources that we just saw, you are passive. You're not pressing on the gas, you're not pressing on the brakes, which you don't have, you're not turning the steering wheel, you're just in the car. So passively, you do not have to commit suicide in order to avoid passively killing somebody. So that resolves that question. What about the active case, like in this picture where you're in a tunnel that's going around a turn and the pedestrian is around the bend? So that will mean that you'll actually have to turn your steering wheel to follow the bend of the road, and you will actively be killing the person. So we saw there's no discrepancy in this case either, and you may not actively murder somebody to save yourself. So in this case, you would be obligated to just go straight and crash yourself into the wall. Now, before you go driving into any tunnel walls, there's one more aspect of this story that needs to be taken into account, and that's what is this pedestrian doing in the middle of a road or tunnel? So it turns out that if the person is there illegally, they have no business being on the road, so now they become what's known in Jewish law a rodef. A rodef is somebody who is pursuing somebody to kill them. Somebody who is pursuing somebody to kill them has basically forfeited their rights, and anybody else can stop them by killing them. And so if there is a person in the road illegally, they have the status of a rodef. They're basically pursuing you in the car to kill you. You're now going to have to drive into the tunnel wall. And so because they're there illegally, because they are now under the status of a pursuer, so they have forfeited their rights, and so you don't have to kill yourself or drive into the tunnel passively in order to avoid them. Okay. So now, with all of that in place, and we understand the tunnel problem and the one against one, we're now ready to approach the trolley problem. Now, the trolley problem, it turns out, was put forth long before 1967. It actually appears in the Jerusalem Talmud in the following format. It says, a group of people were traveling, and marauders chanced upon them, saying, hand over one of your group, or we will kill you all. That's exactly the tunnel problem. One against many. Hand over one person, or all are going to die. So what does the Talmud say? Even if all will be killed, they may not hand over one soul. So that basically is pretty clear deontology. Even if they will all be killed, even if all will be killed, they may not hand over one soul. In that case, in the trolley problem, the trolley would have to continue straight. Now, this is a very difficult conclusion, and so many people have grappled with this idea. The most famous one being the Chazon Ish. His name is Rav Avram Yeshaya Karlitz. He lived in the 1940s and 50s, passed away in 1953. He was brought a trolley problem that happened in his town of Bnei Brak here in Israel. Somebody actually was in a car and had to make such a decision, and they asked the Chazon Ish, what should one do? Now, the Chazon Ish wrote up his discussion and sort of camouflaged it because he didn't want people to think that he was talking about this particular problem in Bnei Brak, and so he called it the missile problem. The missile problem is exactly like the trolley problem. A missile is fired at a group of people. You, standing on the side, have the technological means of diverting the missile. You will save the group of people, but the missile will land on an individual on the side. So it's exactly the trolley problem. The Chazon Ish says as follows. It is possible that this case, this trolley missile case, is unlike the marauders case that we just read in the Jerusalem Talmud, because wherein one person is handed over to be killed. So in the marauders case, you're handing over a person. Because here, for there, the act of handing over someone is a brutal act of killing. When you hand somebody over, that's an act of killing. And the salvation of the others, that you just saved the group of people, is not an inherent part of this act, but is rather the indirect cause of their salvation. That is to say, when you hand over a person, you just killed them. And now, indirectly, the marauders went away and the group was saved, but you didn't really save them. In the missile case, it's completely different. In the missile case, when you move the missile, you have saved the people. And now there's a person there that will be killed. That's not an act of killing, says the Chazon Ish. That's an act of saving. So maybe he says we don't apply that Jerusalem Talmud case. And he says there's also another important distinction to be made here. He says while the act of handing over an individual can be viewed in isolation, meaning, okay, we just killed this guy, the salvation of the group is in fact directly connected to handing over the individual. What he is saying here is that you can't save the people without this one individual dying. This idea was brought forth in an article by Judith Jarvis Thompson. She's a philosophy professor that published an article, appropriately enough, called The Trolley Problem in 1985 in the Yale Journal of Law. And she discusses exactly all the corner cases that the Chazon Ish is talking about. And when she gets to this point, so she gives what's called the transplant dilemma. So the transplant dilemma is as follows. There's a doctor. He has 5 patients that need organs, and he doesn't have any way to get the organs. The 5 people are going to die. One day, a young guy comes in the office looking for an annual checkup, perfectly healthy. The doctor says, I killed the one, I take his organs, I save the 5. Would anybody say that that was a justified act? Of course not. Judith Jarvis Thompson says that violates Kant's rule that says you can never look at people as a means, but rather always as an ends. And so you can't just kill somebody to save more people. So that's exactly what the Chazon Ish is saying here. He's saying that when you hand over the one person to the marauders, that person needs to die. He is inherently part of saving the other group. Whereas in the diverting the missile case, no one has to die. Okay, I divert the missile, I save the people, and now there happens to be somebody else there who happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't need him to die, it's just incidental to the case. And so the Chazon Ish, like Judith Jarvis Thompson, make a distinction and try to say that maybe we could address this trolley problem by utilitarian means. And so that's basically what he says here. Diverting the missile from one side to the other is in its essence an act of salvation, not connected in any way to killing the individual on the other side. It is merely incidental that there happens to be an individual there. And now given that on the one side the multitude will be killed and on the other side one will be killed, it is possible we should strive to minimize losses as much as possible. Once we've cleared off the deontological issues, of course the utilitarian approach is appropriate. But then the Chazon Ish takes a step back and he says, however, here in the missile case, it is weaker than we have made it out to be. For one is killing with one's own hands. Hariga b'yadayim. He says, we are not allowed to kill people. And so even though I've explained that there's a distinction and the guy that is there on the missile case or the trolley case is just there incidentally, nevertheless, when you move that missile, when you turn that trolley or the car, you are killing with your own hands, and that is a violation that we cannot countenance. And so the Chazon Ish ends his whole discussion with Sarich Iyun, and this needs investigation. He does not say how we really should act in this case. Now it turns out that many rabbis have come to the assistance of the Chazon Ish and tried to perform this investigation. One of them is the famous Rabbi Usher Weiss. He is a big Jewish legal thinker living in Jerusalem today. He says, how could the Chazon Ish even think that you might be able to divert the missile or the trolley? Of course you can't kill anybody with your own hands. So the Rav Usher says perhaps he was trying to say, like the Tosfot, that you could be involved passively. That is to say, you would put up a force field over the group of people you want to save. When the missile came, it would bounce off, and the other person would be killed passively, and you would have saved them. But even with this, he ends, Tzarich iyun gadol b'chol zeh. This needs a lot of investigation. So he too does not say how we really should act. The only one who does actually say how we should act is the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg. He brings the Chazon Ish. He takes off the missile example and says we're talking about cars, the one against the many, the trolley problem. And he basically quotes Rabbeinu Yonah, who is the cousin of the Ramban, who wrote a very famous book called Sharei Tshuva, who says that whenever we are approaching such a difficult case between life and life, or life and lives, we cannot make that decision. We don't know whose blood is redder, and so we must remain passive. We cannot actively kill anybody. And in case you weren't sure if that meant one in one or one in many, so the Tzitz Eliezer says, in any case of certain killing, there is no distinction between the individual and the multitude, for we do not say that the multitude is to be favored. Basically, what the Tzitz Eliezer is doing here is taking a Jewish ethic to the nth degree. The fact of the matter is that it was Judaism, with the introduction of the Bible, that brought to humanity the ideal of the individual worth. In the ancient pagan world, people were being sacrificed as individuals for the benefit of the many. Quite literally, people were sacrificed so that the community could have rain or what have you. And all of a sudden, the Torah came and said, man was created in the image of God. What that is saying is just as God is individual and unique, so too every person is individual and unique. And that idea was then picked up by the Talmud that says, man was created alone to teach you that whoever destroys a single soul is as if he destroyed a whole world, and whoever saves a single soul is as if he had saved a whole world. And so basically what we're saying is that each individual has the value of the entire world. And that idea was picked up by Rav Kook, who says it is beyond our power to estimate the value of the whole world, that is the individual, versus the whole world, that is the multitude. And so basically what Rav Kook is saying, he's saying each individual is of infinite worth. And so philosophically speaking, one infinity versus a multitude of infinities is still an identity. We can't make that decision. Now, with all of this philosophical background, we feel like very comfortable with this deontological approach. Nevertheless, there's a voice in the back of your head saying, yeah, but careening a car into 5 people when you could have saved them and only killed one, it still makes us question. That voice was actually articulated to me by the Rosh Yeshiva of Har Etzion, Rav Yaakov Meidan. Rav Yaakov Meidan said, look, who would have an easier time explaining their actions in a court of law after a trolley problem accident? The guy who ran over the 5 and said, I didn't want to turn the wheel, or the guy who killed the 1 and saved 5 people over there? So for Rav Yaakov Meidan, the answer is clear. The utilitarian approach, save as many people as possible. So I said to Rav Yaakov Meidan, I said, I understand where you're coming from, but nevertheless, what about the sources? What about the Jerusalem Talmud that said you don't hand over one person? All the post-scheme used that as their basis for addressing this problem. So he said, I am dust and ashes at their feet, but I beg to differ. That Jerusalem Talmud is talking about a time when people are under attack, and a time of war, when we need to preserve the morale of the community so we don't hand over individuals. But at peacetime, in civil cases, we don't apply that Talmud. So I said, okay, I can understand that. But what about the Gemara in Pesachim? What about whose blood is redder? What about we don't know how to evaluate and assess the value of each person? So he looked at me and he said, Tzarich iyun. This needs investigation. So I thought about this a little bit more, and when I was reading Judith Jarvis Thompson's essay, so she also thought about this a lot, and she came up with the following. She said, indeed, sacrificing the individual is a wrong. Nevertheless, it is a wrong that is permissible for him to do. So what she's saying is there are times when there's something called a permissible wrong. Well, in Jewish ethical thought, there's a thing it's called aveira lishma. It's doing a sin for a greater good. And so perhaps this would fall under that rubric. But the fact of the matter is that it really doesn't apply. The classic case is the case of Queen Esther, depicted here in this painting, where she's giving herself over to the king Ahasuerus. Basically, she is submitting herself to be violated by the king, and so she's committing a sin. Nevertheless, she's doing it for the greater good of saving all the Jewish people. That is an Aveira Lishma, a sin for a noble reason. However, the Nodab Yehuda, who is one of the great Jewish thinkers, said one can only do a sin for a noble cause if one is really going to save all the Jewish people. Otherwise, we don't play that game, and so one cannot apply this to the trolley problem. So that basically concludes our discussion for the trolley problem and the tunnel problem, but really that's all about a human driver. What about when we come to the digital driver, when we come to the autonomous vehicle? So is there a difference? So at first blush, you would say, no. I mean, the computer is just the agent of the human. Whatever applies to the human applies to the computer. There's no difference. But I sat down with the rabbis at Rav Asher Weiss's Institute for Halacha and Technology. They wrote a book on this. And when I discussed these issues with them, they said, you know, there's actually a difference between an autonomous vehicle, between a digital driver and a human driver. There are some circumstances that need to be taken into account. So they brought this sort of system-level perspective. They said, look, when a human driver confronts a trolley problem, they're looking at real people, Yaakov, Leah, Dina. They're going to have to decide who will live and who will die in real time. That's very different than the digital driver. The digital driver, as it were, the autonomous vehicle, is not confronting real people in real time. The digital driver, the autonomous vehicle, that chip that goes into cars is being designed years before the chip will be put into a car, years before that car is a production vehicle on the road, years, if ever, that car will be confronted with a trolley problem. And so basically, the autonomous vehicle is looking at statistical man, and it's trying to raise the statistics. It's trying to raise the probabilities that more people will live. As we said in the beginning, autonomous vehicles are being designed to save lives. They're working under the modus operandi of trying to save as many lives as possible. Therefore, every line of code that is written should be trying to save as many lives as possible, and therefore the rabbis at the Institute of Halacha and Technology say that we should apply utilitarian approach of ethics to this problem, save as many lives as possible. And not only that, the fact of the matter is that now we can probably fall under the rubric of the Chazon Ish, who said that we are doing an act of salvation. We are moving the car away from the multitude and incidentally killing somebody else. But even then, the killing is not hariga b'yadayim. It's not killing with one's own hands. When a car was programmed to save lives, it's not considered killing with one's own hands years later when the car actually takes action. And so basically, I would like to conclude with what I've tried to show you today is that Jewish philosophy is really a beautiful and powerful tool to address even very, very modern technological dilemmas. It's true that the Jewish sources may not have actually explicitly addressed or even resolved the dilemmas that we're dealing with, but they've given us the tools to grapple with these dilemmas and try to find solutions to the problems. And so, as I said, and I will conclude with these words, that is really the power and beauty of Jewish philosophy. Thank you very much.